You know, for a science fiction author, I'm very unlucky with technology. I'm Jaine Fenn, or Jaine Fenn, and I write science fiction, and I've already been introduced. And I've got to say, I could not outdo Simon's fantastic introductions, so I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Stephen.
Easy meat. Well, I'm Stephen Hunt. I've got a book out at the moment from Gollancz, and before that I had 6 fantasy novels out by HarperCollins. So that's me, really.
I'm Tom Lloyd. I write fantasy. How many? 6 novels now and a collection of short stories.
I'm Suzanne McCleod. I write urban fantasy, the spellcrackers.com series set in London. So this is my sort of hometown.
I'm Chris Wooding. I write books for adults and children, and almost all of them sit in some kind of hazy zone between science fiction and fantasy, which makes me ideally placed to not know anything about the difference between them.
I'm Paul McCauley. I'm older than the space age, and my last book starts off with a boy on an asteroid, so there we go.
Right, we haven't got much time, so I thought to get conflict going, I'm going to come up with a contentious statement which you can then take turns demolishing. My contentious statement is, science fiction is the literature of what isn't but could be. Fantasy is the literature of what could never be. Who wants to kill it first? Paul. You didn't make eye contact, you see.
No, you see, I was thinking that's an interesting question. I hope I don't get asked it first. No, I mean, the problem is, one of the things is that you're thinking of these things as 2 distinct entities, and I don't think they are. I think they're rather like, consider a helium atom. Helium atom's got 2 electrons going around it. When I was a kid, we were taught those 2 electrons were like 2 little beads. We now know they're like 2 smears of probability, and those overlap. But within those smears of probability, there is a point. There are points where one electron is more likely to be than the other electron, and that's kind of like genre. There are points where you can say this is probably fantasy, and there are points where you can say this is probably science fiction, but there's a big area of doubt in between where we go, we're not sure. And everybody goes, well, this is where you start trying to do definitions, which I don't think we should do at all, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something in that idea that there's a spectrum where, I mean, I always kind of thought of it as, you know, on one end there's Tolkien and kind of pure, what we kind of think of as traditional fantasy, and then on the other end there's something like Asimov, where you'd think of like pure traditional science fiction, and there's a great deal of space in between where a lot of things can be done. But I do think there's thematic differences, but I mean, I tend to, I don't know if I'd use that difference, but when I think about it, I tend to think that it often seems to be that fantasy is much more obsessed with legend and stuff like this, and it's dealing with kind of like with the kind of human themes that you would find in legendary stories and all this kind of thing, overcoming the great evil, boy becomes king, all these kind of things. And there's examples of this in science fiction as well, like stuff like Dune and Star Wars, but a lot of people could argue that they're science fantasy because they sit in this kind of muddy middle. And I always thought of science fiction as being something whereas fantasy is kind of built on this kind of accretion of earlier books, where it's like, you know, now when we talk about fantasy, we're often using things like Tolkien and people that came before him as this, you know, as a bedrock for us to create the story on. Whereas science fiction, you tend to start from a given point of now, you know, a point where where we can make assumptions, cultural assumptions, technological assumptions, and so forth, and then you can extrapolate them forward in all kinds of crazy ways. So that, to me, is the kind of is the best example of a defining difference I could come up with, because you have to like look at, say, science fiction books like Heliconia or something, and say, well, if we took the people and satellites out of that book, would it be a fantasy book or would it be a science fiction book? And I still think it would be a science fiction book, even if you took all the scientific trappings out of it.
You can just say, is this thing on? Yes, fantastic. You can just say you agree or don't disagree, but I will come back to you later for another one.
I agree with both of you in that I think, particularly when you're talking about story, I think that is the main thing about science fiction and fantasy. That's where it overlaps the story. I think if you take the science side, then a science fiction writer has to probably be able to say that the science they're writing can possibly happen at some point in the future, even if not now. Whereas I think with fantasy, we've got a little bit more leeway. We can just go, hey, it's magic, which is cool. And we don't necessarily have to, you were talking about sort of building. In fantasy, we don't have to build on what's past. We can make our own past up. Whereas I think if you're writing science fiction and you're building on the future, you are building on what's in the past. That's really, to me, the only difference is. Okay, your turn.
Look at Tom.
I'll look at
Yeah, well, I think the only thing I can add really is that I see fantasy as you take a situation, whether or not you've made it up or not, but you're changing one thing or a number of things, and you're seeing how people are living within that. Whereas I don't read a huge amount of science fiction, but what I do read is generally it's about humanity sort of on a sort of a track of progress, and it's much more looking forward to what's coming, and that could be good, that could be that could be bad, but there's something that's the point of conflict. Whereas fantasy, it's usually it looks further back.
Well, I asked my 10-year-old son, I told him the subject of the panel, and I said, what do you think the differences between fantasy and science fiction are? And he said, well, in Warhammer, in science fiction, the orcs have guns. In fantasy, the orcs have swords. So, I mean, that's a pretty good definition, I think, really, if you're going to...
I think we've got to the essence of the problem there.
Exactly. But I guess one of the things that always strikes me about science fiction versus fantasy, and indeed if you're kind of straddling the middle, is that often the characteristic of science fiction is that change is something that is sort of sought after in the plot and is embraced. I mean, even if you take something like Hunger Games, they want to overthrow the old order, which is bad, and put in the new order. When you come to a lot of fantasy, I think it's the opposite. You've got Tolkien, you know, you're lamenting the industrial age, and you know, you're going to replace Sauron with a king, and he's still a king, and that's the kind of attitude with fantasy. Whereas with science fiction, I think there's an element of change being embraced, and that change is good. Perhaps not so much now with the dystopian stuff, but certainly with the kind of classic golden age Star Trek, you know, change was something to be sought after, and
they're not looking back to a golden age. That's not what
yes,
they're
I
about.
suppose that is true. Yes.
Thank you. You've actually all raised some fascinating things which, if we had more time, we would dive into more deeply: change versus stability and future extrapolation. But the title of this is there a thematic difference? And I had to look up thematic, and now I have. I shall ask the question related to it. Are there any subjects or tropes which are restricted to one or other? Now, I suspect Paul's going to say no because he sees it as a spectrum or an atom. But can anyone think, and I'm not going to say put your hand up, but I will give you a couple of seconds to think, of anything, be it a subject matter, we can come on to magic versus tech later maybe, or be it the kind of themes that you would explore, that by putting them in one of the books, you change its nature that simply. This is a tricky question I probably should have put to you before by email, but I'm mean. Yeah, you look like you were about to answer that. Chris, no?
Yeah.
Well, I was going,
No, that's unfair to
picking up from the orcs and swords and orcs with machine guns thing. I mean, maybe one of the differences is that the sort of chief way of getting stuff done in fantasy is the kind of Renaissance artist pupil method, where you spend a lot of time learning the basics, and then you do your masterpiece, and then you're the magician, the master magician, and so on. Whereas, and each of that thing, that's predicated on somebody showing their own individuality in their craft. Whereas in science fiction, anybody can buy the gadget, right? You just buy the gadget, you get the machine gun, and that's it. It's mass production. So the difference is there's mass production in science fiction, and there isn't in fantasy. But then, of course, one always thinks of exceptions.
That's a
but they're deliberate exceptions.
Yeah, but no, I think I think actually, if you take epic fantasy or more traditional fantasy, if you look at urban fantasy, then yes, you can go and buy the spell. You can go and buy the gadget, the magical gadget, and there is mass production. Because a lot of urban fantasy is actually set in the current real world. So therefore, real world commerce becomes part of the fantasy.
But a lot of the characters still have a heritage of some sort.
Yes.
Which
yes.
quite
But then
is sort of lacking from a lot of science fiction.
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter as much who you are, where you've come from.
Possibly. I suppose because urban fantasy still takes the trope of quite often the trope of the special one, the charmed one, or the destiny.
Someone who is different.
Yeah,
So
somebody who's
So
different.
can you order this stuff on Amazon?
Well, yes. Yeah, you can order. Yeah, you can order
So
spells on
SF
Amazon.
is more egalitarian then?
Possibly.
kind of thing.
I think it's good. Well,
yeah.
like the fantasy way of doing
Right.
things is you can still get away with stories that you can't. I don't think you can in fantasy in terms of the boy becomes king thing, and it's just assumed to be good that the boy becomes king. Whereas it's like if you do that in science fiction, starting from now and going forward, we wouldn't really. Now they wouldn't really like a story about the boy becomes ultimate president and rules the world kind of thing, because we're all more cynical than that, and we all know that politics is more complicated than that and all that kind of thing. But it works in a fantasy kind of in a fantasy sphere because of the kind of because of the way the story is told, because of the social setting of the place. So yeah, I think those kind of boy becomes king, rules the land, becomes the good ruler that all the people love. We wouldn't believe in science fiction.
Oh, like Dune, you mean?
Yeah, but as I said, science fantasy. I've already knocked that one off.
Right.
Don't worry.
Stephen?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at thematic differences, I guess if I was writing science fiction, I'll put in lots of rivets. And if I was writing fantasy, I'll put in lots of trees.
I love your simple worldview.
Simplicity always works.
Any more thoughts on that one? No?
Well, with urban fantasy, you can have the rivets and the trees.
Yeah.
And you can take the machine guns and change them into a sword and back again.
Steampunk, surely.
Well, even better, yeah.
That's a different
yeah.
panel. So if you've got, say, a fantasy novel and you end up with something which the reader recognises as a working model of nuclear physics in it, does that break it or make it a science fiction novel?
Well, there's a lot of fantasy books that obviously have been post-apocalyptic and so forth, and
Yes.
so, but they've kind of, I mean, the Terry Brooks ones, I
Which
think
I
it was
loathe
like,
with all my being,
but I
but
think
that's just
I
me.
think it was the fact I can't remember because I don't think I ever read the prequels, but the fact that there were elves and ogres and so forth and was something to do with radiation, right,
Yeah.
or something like that, right? So you did have a scientific reasoning behind a fantastical
Yeah.
world.
I think my
And that
hatred of
didn't
those
blow-
books
that
led
didn't
me
blow
to
the
ask
story.
that particular
I
question,
mean,
but that's
most
just...
most fantasy novels, follow the law of gravity, for instance. They might have 7-league boots that violate it, but you're deliberately violating with those 7-league boots. Generally assume that you drop the thing in a fantasy novel, it's going to fall to the ground, it's not going to fall up. In a science fiction novel, on the other hand, you see, it could fall up. But then you'd have to explain why. And this is maybe one of the differences, that your assumptions embedded in a fantasy novel are embedded. And you can talk about the rules and so on, but that's like talking about the rules of conservation of momentum in a science fiction novel. But in a science fiction novel, it's not necessarily, you can't make those assumptions so much because you may not be talking about this world.
So you can get away with more in science fiction, but you may have to show your workings.
Yeah, well, I like showing my workings, but of course that leads on to the other problem of, info dumps and all that nonsense. Fantasy novels have maps, science fiction novels have info dumps. There we are, we're done.
No, fantasy novels have info dumps too, don't we? I don't know if I agree with that, because fantasy you still can do anything in your fantasy world, but it follows the same rules as science fiction and any good storytelling, in that if you do something ridiculous, you've got to be able to basically set it up and give it stake. You have to let the reader know how it works, what is good about it, what is bad about it, because you can't have the guy in Act 3 just pull a magical power out of his ass and save the universe. It's you have to set it all up first, and you have to made out that it's not something he can just magically do. If he's going for the sword which destroys everything, you have to at least explain what it is, what it does, make it hard to get, all that kind of stuff. I mean, but within those bounds, you can do anything with fantasy. You can obviously break the laws of gravity. You can have there've been loads of fantasies about people with wings and so on and so on.
You can basically make your own rules up, but you still have to have the rules, otherwise.
Yeah, you still have to explain the rules.
The story's not going to work.
Yeah,
is it?
That's where info dumps come in, even in fantasy.
So, the extreme of science fiction is hard science fiction, where the story is driven by a scientific idea. Is there an equivalent in fantasy? I know I'm looking at the fantasy authors mainly, but science fiction authors are welcome to chime in. Is there? I mean, obviously there are fantasy novels where magic is at the core of it, but magical theory driving a novel or something equivalent that I'm missing because I'm not a fantasy author? Can anyone think of any examples?
I don't know, I mean, the closest I can think of is something like Brandon Sanderson, because he spends so much time crafting his magical systems and
does
bases a lot of
his
stuff around
plots come directly from that, do they? Because I've not read any of his
I
stuff.
don't know, I only got halfway through the first one and threw it away.
What a ringing endorsement that was.
Not a fan, sorry.
They do to a fair degree, yeah. And there are a number of authors. I think Pat Rothfuss also does something similar. That he's got much more of a sort of scientific idea of his magic system. And it seems to me that actually there are a lot of American fantasy authors that do it that way, and it's the magic system is almost a hook that people get their head around, and that once they've sort of got their head around it, they then fully immerse themselves into the world.
Slag off some more authors.
I wasn't saying it was
That Alan Roberts guy, whoa, let me tell you about him.
We've got people like Joe Abercrombie, of course, who just make it up and they have no idea.
So that's magic. Is there anything else in fantasy that can drive the fantasy plot that couldn't drive a science fiction plot? Well, you haven't got the equivalent of science. You haven't got the equivalent, and do correct me if I'm wrong, of the big idea that somebody's had that's just thought, I can turn that idea into a story using people to make that story live.
But I think that's any idea. You can take any idea
Yes.
and use people to make the
Absolutely,
idea
sorry,
live.
I didn't explain that very well. An idea which is, for example, that you read in New Scientist or whatever, an idea which is about cutting-edge science, technology, or theories of the world, which
and turn it into a fantasy.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you can do that.
Has anyone done it? Because I would genuinely like to read that. And I don't say that sarcastically, I say that because I genuinely like to read that.
Yeah, I read a story, I don't know if it's fantasy or horror, but there's this thing called Boltzmann brains, only there aren't these things called Boltzmann brains anymore, unfortunately, which was basically trying to explain the bigness of the universe in that you could have a brain, a functioning brain, pop out of nowhere. Okay, Boltzmann brain. It was to get around a paradox, so we haven't got time to explain. Anyway, so I just thought, well, what happens if they turn up in London? And then they start changing the laws of physics. Okay, so
That would be cool.
there we are. So it's basically a zombie story with
Yeah, you see, so
physics.
it's not actually fantasy.
Okay. Well, it's still a fantasy because they start changing the laws of physics.
I've been given the
Captain.
5-minute warning, so if you have more to add on this, if not,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask my last really important and totally serious question, and you all have to answer this. Who wins when it's dragon versus spaceship? Steve.
Spaceship every time.
And your reasoning?
I've read Anne McCaffrey.
Tom.
Yeah, I'd say spaceship as well.
Even though you're a fantasy writer.
Yeah, well, in books or in movies, generally the dragons you see, they're not going to be as big as some of the spaceships you see. The firepower they bring to bear won't be enough.
What if they've got magic as well?
Well,
Dragon versus...
I'm going to go dragons.
Excellent.
Dragons will win because spaceships, I know you can have artificial intelligence, but at the end of the day, the
you have to have
spaceship...
someone driving the spaceship.
And you can have somebody driving the spaceship, yes, but I think if you have a really good dragon who's intelligent, knows what they're at, then they can be the underdog and they're going to win.
Yeah, I'm going to go dragon because spacecraft commanders are by definition arrogant. So the dragon, dragon flies to the edge of space, sticks his tongue out of the spacecraft, makes it chase him down, and then just gets the angle of entry too much. Spacecraft burns up.
That's a story.
There you go.
Fantastically, we've got 2 versus 2, and the deciding vote goes to Paul.
Well,
Mecha dragon.
Mecha Dragon. Wasn't that one of those Japanese films? Well, practically the spaceship would always win, but we always want the dragon to actually win in our hearts.
And that, I think, is a fantastic note to finish on. I'd like to thank all of my panellists and you for listening.